I admit, Shadwen stuck out to me because the last game I played was A Plague Tale: Innocence. When I saw Shadwen in my Steam library and noticed the many similarities it has to A Plague Tale: Innocence, I simply had to play it in order to see if these similarities run any deeper and how their respective design might say something about the other. Now, I'm not going to turn this review into just a comparison between the two games. That would be unfair to Shadwen, when I could instead be talking about it based on its own merits. So very quickly here at the beginning, a short comparison. Both games are stealth action games set in medieval times, and both feature a female protagonist with long braided hair tasked with escorting a younger character. And that's honestly where most of the similarities end and where I could start pointing out differences. But since I'll be talking about Shadwen exclusively from now on, you'll probably see these differences anyway without me constantly mentioning A Plague Tale: Innocence. So yeah, Shadwen is a stealth action game, but very much more focused on the stealth portion rather than the action portion. Meaning that getting seen is not an option here, since that basically spells instant death at the hands of some very trigger-happy crossbow-wielding guards. It stars the eponymous Shadwen. And with a name like that, there weren't many other career options open besides a sneaky assassin. So yeah, Shadwen is on a mission to assassinate the king of some unspecified country for wronging her in some way. The game is mostly just one lengthy intrusion across the many city districts that surround the castle. But there is a spanner in the works in the form of Lily, a young orphan whom Shadwen rescues at the start of the game and who insists on following along with her throughout her adventure. Now, I can already tell that some of you got that nervous eye twitching from years of forced stealth section made worse by also being escort quests. And I admit, framing the entire game as a giant escort quest was a strange decision. However, the game makes up for it by making Lily automatically advance through enemy territory unseen. So it's more that you have to create a path in front of her to follow rather than shepherd her from point to point. I mean, you can do that if you want to turn off the auto-follow option in the settings, but why would you masochist? You can still manually direct her, though it's often a crapshoot if she'll actually follow you and go where you intend to navigate her through. It never got so bad that it made me want to outright quit the game, but I'll still mention that this aspect will have a high potential for frustration for some people. Now, I've implied that Lily is fairly competent in navigating these spaces, to the point where she'll actually clear quite large stretches of any given level without the player needing to lift as much as a finger. However, that has as much to do with the design of the game as it does with how janky it is. I'm not gonna lie here, it's extremely apparent that Shadwen is an indie release. There are so many rough edges around this game that are on display on a constant basis. Lily's pathfinding is sometimes hilarious when she wanders straight through enemy sightlines that somehow don't register her, while at other times refusing to move from cover to cover when the opportunity presents itself. Enemies also have laughably bad pathfinding and often walk straight into each other for seconds before managing to get past one another. And while they sometimes manage to see Shadwen if she's standing somewhere above them, most of the time they're blind as bats and mostly rely on their therefore elevated hearing. And speaking of jank, it's fucking hilarious to see Shadwen dangle around at the end of her hookshot rope, flopping around in the physics engine like a stranded fish. Now, all of that jank doesn't mean I hated the game. Far from it, I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. And the reason for that, as I've stated in many prior reviews about stealth games, is that it does stealth right. Shadwen is competent enough and has the necessary tools available to get around these enemies in ways that are fun. Now, when I say tools, what I actually mean is tool, singular. Because the aforementioned hookshot is mostly all you really need. And what a damn excellent implementation that is. Since the game is very much physics focused, there are a lot of ways you can manipulate the environments to create paths for Lily to follow. You can push around boxes if you want to be boring, or you can use your hookshot to drag and dangle boxes around to generate sounds that lure enemies away from the path you're trying to clear, while you're also constantly trying to remain hidden. And I found this approach to be very rewarding, since it carried me through the entire game. This is what I mean when I say I like stealth games that give you options for stuff to happen that the level designers didn't 100% preconceive of. I'm sure there's a quote-unquote correct way of beating these levels, but I like that the developers still give players the option of doing it however they see fit, regardless how janky the result might look in the footage. Now, while I personally would have been fine with just a hookshot, Shadwen also has a bunch of craftable tools in there like bombs, arrow traps, and a couple of decoys to distract guards. But while I almost never really needed the latter, save for very few instances, the former went entirely unused because I wanted to go for the non-lethal run. That's right, it's a stealth game where you can actually pull off a completely non-lethal run from beginning to end. So forgive me, Frozenbyte, for not using all the fancy tools you probably put quite a bit of effort into designing and implementing. But I think the best idea they've had was the time rewind mechanic. As you may have noticed from the footage here, the game every so often completely freezes. This isn't a bug, as I initially feared, but completely by design. Yes, just like Superhot, or any proper roguelike really, time only moves when you move. And since much of this game can be a bit trial and error prone, especially if you want to do things non-lethally and sometimes it's not clear how much force is required to kill a guard, the developers just lifted Prince of Persia's time rewind mechanic. So you can immediately undo your actions and try a different approach. I don't know how much of the gameplay gets recorded for you to rewind through, but I've tested it at one point and managed to go back quite a while to a very early state of the level. I feel the game would have been much more frustrating had this mechanic not existed, and I think the developers knew. But as it stands, every mistake is just a button press away from undoing, and I like that very much. Is it explained in the narrative or justified anywhere? No. But the game is certainly better off for having said mechanic than not having it. Though it is a bit tedious having to push a dedicated button to move time forwards if you're just trying to stand still and wait out guard patrols. But yeah, that's about it from the gameplay perspective. I generally like the progression through the levels a lot. It's one of the few games I've played that actually gets harder the longer you play, since the opportunities to Batman yourself through elevated vantage points continuously shrinks while enemy density keeps going up. It mostly works and doesn't get too overwhelming, except for this particular spot that somewhat tested my patience. Though it does become a bit comical by the end when you're infiltrating the castle and still see giant bushes littered around the halls and corridors to give Lily a place to hide. And while it has a decent length to last you a couple of hours, it's clear it's also somewhat brushing up against how far you can carry a game like this, since the scenery never changes much and without much in terms of narrative going on. And that's really where the game sadly feels a bit underwhelming. There's not much interaction between the two female leads beyond the exchanges between levels on loading screens, and what's there doesn't really do much for me. The guards also have quite a bit of stuff to say while they're idling around, and it's used to flesh out the world and story a bit, but it's just as often inconsequential fluff you could entirely skip without missing much. In conclusion, I'll give Shadwen a mild but very warm recommendation. I personally had fun with it, even with all the jankiness. But jank is something I can live with if I get a nice and entertaining little stealth experience out of it. It's a shame that there's not much meat on the bone in the story department, but forgivable for an experience that mostly just exists for the gameplay.